Good evening, everybody. Before we begin, it's okay to come up closer. It's not church, synagogue, or a mosque. I'm very pleased that our friends from C-SPAN are here. So this will be broadcast at some point, sooner than later, I'm sure, and they always do a great job, and want to welcome C-SPAN again to Politics and Prose. C-SPAN has added to our civil discourse. And whatever bookstores you come to, they're generally independents, and C-SPAN is really wonderful. I want to welcome tonight Kevin Matsons, and we're celebrating the publication of his book, Just Plain Dick. How many of you were around when the Checkers speech was given? And I'm sure many people in the audience tonight will also have been around in the TV audience. It brings back a lot of memories, and it's particularly appropriate that this is the night before an election. And this book is about the 1952 election and America in the context of the 1952 election. And Kevin Matson will tell us about it. But you know, there's a nice tradition at Politics and Prose of having wonderful stuff the night before the election. We were talking 12 years ago was the discussion of Arguing the World, which was the discussion with Daniel Bell, Irving Kristol, Irving Howe, Nat Glazer. And 4 years ago, we had a New York Review book, and some of the contributors, Elizabeth Drew, Michael Tomasky, Jonathan Friedland, others, were talking about the problems that whoever the new president would be was likely to face. And anticipating an Obama win that night, there was some prescience about the use of the filibuster to block consideration of things. So tonight we'll get some historic perspective. I've had the good fortune to read a lot of Kevin Matson's books, and he's a wonderful historian of post-war liberalism. He tells it in ways that are very perceptive. He avoids fashionable trends to make sure he gets underneath things, so he's not a revisionist. And he writes about other periods as well, including participatory democracy in the progressive era, and Upton Sinclair. I'm sure many of you have read The Jungle, and we're all too young to remember End Poverty in California, his effort at gubernatorial campaign. But Kevin provides a rich history of 20th century American history in the context of our larger scheme of things. So let's welcome Kevin Matson and Just Plain Dick.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and it's always a pleasure to be at Politics and Prose, one of my favorite places to be. What I'll do is, talk for a little while, and then obviously be eager to entertain questions that you might have about the book and about, its relationship to contemporary politics or what have you. What brought me to write this book was I had always heard the term checkers throughout my life, a checkers moment, a checkers speech, or something like that. And I really wanted to understand what that meant, to understand the speech in its origins, and also to put it in a kind of wider context. So that's what I really kind of began with. I think it's in some ways one of the most important speeches in post-war American history, and it certainly had a lot to do with explaining the rise to influence of Richard Nixon, and that in and of itself tells us that it had a lot to do with a lot about contemporary American politics because of Nixon's influence, I think, on our contemporary political culture. Now, with that said, what I really wanted to do was actually I wanted to write history in the form of a novel. All the characters are real, the events are real, there's nothing fictionalized in this, but I wanted to tell it in a kind of from a novelist's perspective. It has at its center a madman. In fact, I originally wanted to have madman in the title or the subtitle of the book. My editor frowned upon that. I'm actually using the term not the way Nixon will later use it to describe his foreign policy, but actually in the way that Holden Caulfield describes himself in the classic novel Catcher in the Rye, which documents itself a kind of progression towards nervous breakdown. Richard Nixon is undergoing a nervous breakdown during this story. He is thinking of himself kind of in that sense of being mad in all the connotations that term has. And he knows that he's on the cusp of either making or breaking his national political career. It's the moment at which he rescues his political career from that moment onwards. There's a real noir feeling to the book to a large extent, I think, and I think that has to do with its subject matter. Richard Nixon is a noirish character, kind of dark in terms of his own psychology. And I've also wanted to kind of tell a suspense story. Again, trying to write history as a novelist would ideally do. There's a very tight internal structure to the book. It looks really it's kind of a slice of history, looking at a moment. It starts with Nixon's rise to national popularity, his eventually being put on the ticket during spring of 1952. It follows the conventions of the summer. These conventions were one of the last set of conventions where things were actually determined during a convention, even though television is starting to take over conventions and conventions are starting to become more scripted. There's actual serious political decision-making going on at these conventions in 1952. Then I go into the scandal in September that becomes the basis for why Nixon has to give this speech. And then obviously the speech itself is kind of the culmination of the book, or at least a high point of the book, because the book then also follows out the election itself, which, as some of you probably know, was a landslide election for the Republican Party in 1952. It's clearly a transformative election where the Republicans seized the presidency, which they hadn't had for quite some time. Nixon undergoes a kind of transformation throughout the story. He begins as a kind of nervous, what I call an inside dopester, using a term that David Reisman, the sociologist, had coined, trying to kind of navigate his way in national politics. He moves from being a nervous person, approaching a nervous breakdown, to becoming a kind of supreme confidence man, a person who feels very confident in his own salesmanship of politics. As all ideally good novels have, this has a great, I think, set of secondary characters. I mean, Nixon's enough to sustain a book, but there are also some really wonderful secondary characters. Obviously, Dwight Eisenhower himself, who comes off as a kind of sad and tragic figure in this book. He starts off as the kind of general on a white horse who comes back to redeem the Republic and to slap back corruption of the Truman administration and return the Republic to its ideal values. But he's also someone who just winds up going further and further to the right and placating the right within his own party, and I think kind of betraying some of his own political principles. The relationship between Nixon and Eisenhower is a very curious one and also very interesting. It's kind of got a father-son sort of element and a kind of almost an Oedipal struggle going on. There's a lot of pundits who enter the book, including Joe Alsop and Walter Lippmann, who are hoping that Eisenhower will be more than what Eisenhower actually does become. There's Pat Nixon, who's really kind of a prop to Dick Nixon, quite literally during the speech. She's sitting there watching him nervously, not sure what exactly he's going to be saying. As she reports it out. She's crucial to the strategy of making her husband into a normal-looking guy. She writes a whole slew of articles about where she talks about her being a normal suburban housewife. But there's also a real fascinating thing about Pat Nixon, and that's that she's weirdly open about the fact that she doesn't really seem to like politics and seems to even have some kind of trepidation about being with her husband. She writes an article, a kind of puff piece for her her husband that has in its title "A Wonderful Guy," in which she has this quote that I make a lot of, which is she says, "Dick doesn't do anything in a half-hearted manner, so I know that we're in for a rugged time." And this isn't a piece that's supposedly a celebration of her husband's virtues, and yet she's kind of saying she's worried about him, about what her life is going to be.